You know, this is still at a partial level from what you're describing, that it requires a kind of larger scale spatial vision. There are these little projects that may be contributing towards improving the situation, but I'm not sure that they have done this on the basis of a larger scale look at injustice with regard to public transit in Portland. And I just want to encourage this larger scale vision first, because, as I said, I think there's a tremendous need, and in part it's also an answer to the first question. There's an enormous need to develop good methods to do what the Supreme Court now forbids you to do, and that is to do a spatial justice test on plans, on designs, on whatever, to sort of say, this design has a high degree of spatial injustice, or a middling degree, or a low degree. How do we do that? Is to me a very interesting challenge. I don't have easy answers, but I think there's a lot of tools around. And again, this is supposed to be kind of tools lecture, so it's appropriate to identify this as well.
I'm going to steal two other thoughts that I had, or one about Jan Gehl in Copenhagen, and what they're doing in terms of the public space. So that's coming to mind. I would love your thoughts on that. And then also your thoughts on what's happening here in Montreal and Quebec, the student movement.
Well, yeah, Copenhagen and Amsterdam are very interesting places for very innovative ideas about public space. Amsterdam has been constricting its democratic spaces over these last 10 years, but Copenhagen, from what I hear, has been very open. I think they've been particularly innovative with housing and the kind of cooperative housing and collective housing process. But again, you know, I'm very peculiar. I really want that spatial assertiveness explicitly there. Yeah, I think some of it is there in Copenhagen. Now, Montreal, I really don't know about. I'm just picking up bits and pieces of some things that are very exciting. I know, I just checked, and nobody here seems to talk about it, but there was some Charter for Human Rights and Responsibilities in 2007 in Montreal, in which Montreal attached itself to the International Charter for the Rights to the City. The first city to explicitly connect itself to this global charter for the right to the city. There are dozens of cities in Europe doing this. And so Montreal has been innovative for a number of years now. Somebody just showed me the red squares yesterday. I didn't notice them before, and it's hard to read. And I would love to find out whether anybody has done some surveys. Get the architects out, you know, go and take some pictures and what's going on. So, I mean, there's a lot of things I'd like to know about. I know somebody wrote to me this morning, who's I'm hoping is here, about a local Concordia-based demonstration of right to the city in one of the squares in I guess, downtown Montreal. And so Montreal seems to be an extremely lively place for things that sound very much like what I'm talking about, but I just don't know enough. I want to know much more about what's going on. One of the things that I've reacted to is that what's very interesting, and I don't know what to make of it, but it's certainly something that strikes me, and that is the Franco-Anglo divide in Montreal. You know, I don't know how this works itself out, if it does. But, you know, I don't know, is there border crossing between them, or is there only an Anglo movement and a Francophone movement, and never the twain meets? I don't know. But certainly that's one of the questions I have, because people have been telling me about things that are either Francophone or Anglophone. And I know the westbound story because I'm a regionalist. I'm really interested in regional urbanization, which is another thing I'm writing about. And I may give a lecture on this later on. And so Montreal was very exciting when it decided to do macro-regional planning and create this large-scale region and absorb all of the fragmented Anglophonic islands that had islands of advantage and so on that had evolved over the years. And then I hear that the whole regional plan was challenged by wealthy white people, wealthy Anglo people. And I don't know what's happened to it. It sounds like it just gave up on some of its most interesting ambitions. Right? So I want to also know more about what's happening with regionalism in Montreal, because again, regional issues are very important even for what I was talking about here.
I would say I think there is a pretty healthy mix of French and English. There is a interlap and exchange. I'm perfectly bilingual, and a lot of organizations there's a crossover. I think that the language divide is evolving quite a bit, or shrinking or blending. And Westmount's not just Anglophone. Hey, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, here I am. I was wondering, I was sort of going to ask whose justice we're talking about and whose advantages, because presumably the moment, say someone is being discriminated by a certain system, be it the transportational system in LA, we could assume that there's also people who, for whom there's advantage generated in that discrimination. And then, so the question is, within what framework can we develop a moral and ethical understanding of how we determine this understanding of justice and what it means in that situation and whose justice we're fighting for, etc. So how do we then tie these thoughts to practice? Like, where do we have these conversations? What are the forums in which we can have these conversations, and how can we tie those conversations to what's happening in practice?
Well, at one level, there's an easy answer that there are clearly oppressed minorities that have a premium with regard to the social movements that I'm talking about, and that the injustices are concentrated there, and the struggle needs to be around, the classical division by wealth and poverty in the city, that the wealthy get their way with urban policy and urban decision making more than the poor, and that in some cases we have a desperate situation. These transit-dependent population. That's why that's so important, because you answer who. It's the transit-dependent population that was the relevant group in the bus riders union. But before I get to that, staying with that easy part, there's a really difficult part, answer to your question, that is very much related to the Occupy politics and attitudes, in that they're trying to achieve a kind of leaderlessness, acephalous anarchist kind of openness, because they don't want to be controlled by any kind of outside authority. This is related to the absence of singular kinds of projects and visions. It prevents me from calling what they do spatial, because I don't know, they might not even want it. But what was interesting in LA, again, related to Occupy, LA is usually ignored in sort of the new studies on the Occupy movement that are going on, although it was the longest lasting, the only one in which the police started bringing food to the Occupy people, and the only one in which the city council unanimously voted to support the Occupy movement. But when the city council announced that it was in complete support of the Occupy movement and wanted all banks that do business with the city of Los Angeles to show this responsibility that the Occupy people were fighting for, the leaders of the, well, not leaders, I can't call them leaders, lots of members of the Occupy area, people, came out and said, this city council, they're just rich people. We don't want their money. We don't want their leadership. They rejected this support by the city council, as they rejected union support, as they rejected any kind of outside support that threatened to challenge their, I guess there's a wonderful word that they use which seems very spatial to me, horizontality. And this horizontality makes the question of whose justice and who benefits and so on really complicated. And so I'm trying to navigate this situation where it's very straightforward who benefits and who becomes the basis for the struggle into a situation which is sort of has ripped this open into a kind of complexity that I don't yet know how to deal with. It's very interesting, but it seems to be going in directions that I don't know how to interpret. So I don't. It's still a good question, but partly there's a very easy answer. You know who you're fighting for, and in terms of justice. The more difficult question is how bad injustices do they have to be before you mobilize to fight them? And how do you define that becomes also related to your question. But that's as good an answer as I can give, I think.
Yeah, so I was interested, you spoke earlier about the fact that there's a certain concentration of poverty and migrant labor in Los Angeles that I think you named as one of the reasons why this kind of organizing has been able to take shape. And I'm wondering what role specifically Latin American migrants have played in that, and to what extent you see ties between what's emerged in Los Angeles and the sort of...
Did you say Latin American?
Yeah. I'm thinking about a more present, more current history of collective struggle in Mexico. We see what's happening with the elections now, and to what extent that sort of culture or history of collective resistance has informed the way in which migrant laborers have been able to claim these rights that the sort of traditional American union system has kind of given up on.
Yeah, the Latin American connection is very, very complicated and very interesting. Not just the Mexican. The justice riots in LA, for example, the Mexican-American barrio was very quiet. Almost no participation, no struggles, no looting, no arson, no anything. No demonstrations. Most of the demonstrations took place in the main Central American area, Nicaraguan, Salvadoran, people with national traditions of radical mobilization. And that's what is a powerful force from Latin America, the Central American countries in particular. The other connection that comes to my mind, again, partly because it's regional and it relates to the media and the whole social networking, is Chiapas and the Chiapas movement, which is a radical movement, because there's the Mexico City and most of the Mexican core there's no real stimulating political force that's coming into LA or coming out of LA into Mexico, in part because everything is blocked by the drug problems on the border. The maquiladoras used to be an organizing focus, but given what's happening with the drug lords, it's difficult to get back to that as an organizing focus. So Mexican and American kinds of relations are not playing a very big role in this. And if anything, they're playing a sort of slightly conservative role. The mayor, there were very high expectations for a mayor who was brought up in labor unions and so on, labor community organizations and labor struggles in Villaraigosa. He's been a very conservative mayor. And totally ignores the bus riders union and talks about railways to the sea and all kinds of other dreams. So it's very complicated. I don't know what's also happening with ties into Venezuela and Bolivia and other, Argentina and other developments. There are not that many happening in LA. It's mainly the Central American connection is a vital one. And they were very involved in '92. They've been involved in almost everything. And they stand out. The Koreans stand out for the Asian involvement. The Koreans have been very much involved in all of this, not just as the receivers of black anger in '92, but as activists, organizations for immigrant workers. But the very beginning of the question that you had is what excites me so much about this agglomeration of the working poor, as I called it, I'm afraid connects up into some very technical stuff in geographical economics today that is beginning to argue something that even in my wildest dreams of asserting the importance of geography, I couldn't dream of. And that's what Nobel Prize winning people are now beginning to suggest, that agglomerations, urbanization, economies, things that come, magical forces that come from urbanization that we don't know about because nobody studied them ever. But these are now being recognized as the primary causes of economic development, technological innovation, and oh my God, cultural creativity. You know, Michael Porter, a business professor at Harvard, and Richard Florida are making millions of dollars out of this. Porter's Mr. Cluster and Florida's Mr. Creative Class and city planners. There's no one more influential on planning all over the world than Richard Florida. And what he bases his inspiration on is a tiny book by Jane Jacobs called The Economy of Cities, 1969, which is the start of it all. I mean, really theoretical development economists who won Nobel prizes have said, oh, this is the most inspirational book in the world. Jane Jacobs, she should have won a Nobel Prize. She can't do it now because she's dead. Because the Economist Prize, you have to be alive. And the textbooks are now saying this, that cities generate a force that is the primary force for economic development. And they call this Jane Jacobs externalities. I mean, we've got to stop these economists from dominating this. And architects and planners and geographers and sociologists and anthropologists need to begin to recognize this extraordinarily powerful force that's coming from cities that we know so little about because nobody studied it except this weird woman writing this in 1969 when everybody thought she was crazy. No, it's true. There's nothing else. What's the literature? There's no other literature. There's, what's his name, Agglomeration Economies, Marshall, the economist at the turn of the century. That 2 books. All of social science ignores urban spatial causality. Geographers are afraid of it. Architects keep it secret. They think they can shape, I mean, Le Corbusier, architectural revolution. That's the ultimate statement of this belief that architecture design can shape behavior. But we're talking now about all economic development, all cultural, all artistic movements are urban generated. Is all art urban art? Oh my God. You know, there is that possibility, you know, and there's no literature. Nobody's doing this. Look up urban art in all of the art history books. Where do they tell you? Çatalhöyük. That's Jane Jacobs' place. It's very weird. So, but this is what I'm arguing behind what I said about this agglomeration of the working poor being very generative of these social movements in Los Angeles. Like Manchester. Engels said, a lot of things about other things, housing, planning, is never going to work because you have to transform the whole system. But what he did say, and he noted concentric zones and so on that the Chicago school took up. But what he did say was that, the density of people interacting, workers and people, reserve army and lumpen proletariat seeing each other every day and interacting and eating together, and they're going to start getting ideas. This is what Jane Jacobs said. It's not because people are smarter in cities, but because this sort of thickness of social interaction encourages new ways of dealing with problems. I want to say this, and I do say it. I do make this claim, but there's almost no basis. There's no scientific or objective or analytical work on this. This is one of the greatest frontiers in the world, and I'm so excited in my old age about the geography stuff, but nobody else seems to be excited. Very few geographers seem to be excited. But there's so much there, and it's so fascinating. Art being creativity coming from people face-to-face contacts in cities. Wow. It was very exciting, very interesting. I'm sorry, this is what keeps me going.
Two things. One, an invitation, and the second thing, a question. I work as a community organizer in a neighborhood in Montreal, which has a long history of fighting for housing, questions around space, questions of memory in the neighborhood, questions of identity. So perhaps after I can give you my card and maybe you can come for a visit. It's not that far from here. It's about 15 minutes. I think you get a good sense of Montreal and some of the history and the present issues. Anyway, we'll talk about that. My question is, why are you reticent to consider gated communities as an example of spatial injustice? When I think of gated communities, I also think of them in terms there's a project that's in construction just a few streets from here on St. Catherine, which is a 450-unit condominium project. And their advertisement puts the emphasis on certain amenities like spas, pools, terraces, gymnasiums, sauna, which obviously, and they're going to be, that's going to be not just gated, it's going to be guarded facilities, which cuts it off obviously from the others on the street, and the area in which it's being built is an area which is being quickly, it's been going on for 30 years, but it's accelerating in terms of its gentrification and the marginalization of a lot of populations. So I'm curious as to why you hesitate to think of gated communities or that kind of condominium project as examples of spatial injustice.
Oh, you're asking why I even question?
Why you hesitate? Yeah, why you put question marks?
Just on your invitation, my immediate query is whether it has to do with whether you're involved in significant cross-cutting coalition building, because I don't think deep neighborhood movements are likely to be successful in the contemporary scene unless they organize on a regional scale and develop cross-cutting alliances with a number of other organizations that share some of this spatial oppression. So I know there are many examples of rich neighborhood, long-time struggles and community-based kinds of organizations, but I don't think they're going to be like normal unions on their own. Are not going to be as successful as they used to be. But in terms of coalition building, maybe there's some other kinds of issues. On the gated communities, I just left it open because it's, I usually see it at a macro scale, and on not project by, if you do it project by project, this is individual choice and you can't do anything about it, but it also separates it from the neighborhood. But on a larger scale, there is the degree to which the fact when gated communities become the primary form of housing, you have the potential for the secession of the rich, that they, unlike the rich in the past, who might move to suburbs or villas or whatever, now they try to escape from the city. And so you're getting the loss of urban responsibility in these gated communities. And so that provokes just the question of, do we develop policy, again, as a planner, or at least in the planning department, the question of what kind of policy should there be? Do we prohibit gated communities? And then I started saying, well, no, you can't do that. I don't want to bow to the kind of arguments that this is democratic and freedom and free market kinds of arguments, so how can you restrict it? But at the same time, what do? Do you stop it? Do you prevent people building this? And it's these kinds of questions. I mean, the policy response, is it worth organizing against gated communities? And struggling for spatial justice around gated communities? I don't know. And that's why at least I have some questions about it. Yeah, there's all kinds of things that can be piled up on the negative side on gated communities, and maybe not so much on the positive side, but when you translate it into some form of activism and policy action, it's very difficult to deal with. I'm sorry, that's, I don't know, but that's what gives me the question marks. But makes me listed. I mean, it's there as a possibility, but I'm not sure if it's as important as the others that I was listing. I sometimes upset my students, my progressive students mainly, in my class when I occasionally say things like, actually, gentrification is a little bit better than the gated community movement. And so you can't say anything positive about gentrification. And I said, well, I don't know. It's not quite as bad as it used to be in comparison to this large-scale development of gated communities, where people are trying to completely escape. At least the gentrifiers are committing themselves to the urban, to the city. They may not be aware of their negative effects. Maybe they are aware of their negative effects, and they'll still do it. But sometimes gentrification looks better than the secession of the rich into gated communities. Don't say Soja said gentrification is good, please.
There was already a question about your opinion about Montreal, so I understood that you're just newly arrived, so I will ask you for how long you will be in Montreal. And secondly, briefly, maybe if you can tell us about your methodology, how will you learn more, or how will you integrate this into your thinking, the situation that Montreal is living right now? And if I may, I suggest to you maybe you go in the eastern part of the city, because the cleavage, the division or cleavage you noticed exists, and a different movement is happening. There are sometimes the movement is linked, but sometimes separate. So I think it could be interesting for you to, maybe you have, but
yeah.
But I would like to know more about your methodology, or
well, first, the first question. I'm going to be here for another 5 weeks. So I'll be here until August 10th or something like that. And what your comment and a number of other comments are suggesting is that I need some sort of guru, somebody who can look at this larger variety of things, because there does seem to be so many things happening in Montreal that maybe 6 weeks is not enough. But I'm not going to be able to or want to spend all my time doing that. How does it fit in? Well, I'm finishing off this book on Los Angeles with a chapter on seeking spatial justice, but it's mainly on Los Angeles. But it's part of another project that I'm writing with a former student who's now got his doctorate, and has been one of the leading graffiti artists in LA, and he did his dissertation on the graffiti murals movement. And so we're trying to write a piece on some of the Right to the City and Occupy movements, LA, but more than LA, and how graffiti intersects. Graffiti artists have intersected, because in LA it's become extremely close, rich. The graffiti artists have done all of the logos and all of the Occupy stuff, and they're fantastically beautiful. We're not allowed to say that they're so beautiful, but they are quite beautiful pictures that they've done. And I'm also writing, ask how it fits in, I have in mind, and this may be something I can do here as well, a book that starts with a project that I did called Painting Los Angeles. And it had to do with interpreting the early scene painting movement in Los Angeles, which has been dismissed as just a bunch of people doing colorful pictures, to argue that this was a very politicized organization. Even though the Disney cartoonists, the early ones, were artists who did paintings of union movements and meetings and politics that just are forgotten. So sort of recover that. And then I'm particularly interested in one of the Mexican, well, who are called Mexican muralists, Alfredo Siqueiros. And Siqueiros was the wildest, most politically left of all of them, much more than Rivera and Frida Kahlo and all of that. But he did a famous mural painting in downtown Los Angeles that was whitewashed in 1 week because it was so politically sensitive. I mean, it showed Mexican peasants sleeping and American soldiers with guns and rockets and things standing above them. And it was just unacceptable to the powers in LA. But he subsequently was almost forced out of the United States, but went to New York. And Siqueiros is the first spray can painter, the originator of the bulbous lettering that you see in graffiti, which I always wonder, where did that come from? It comes from Siqueiros, who in New York City, I have been finding out, taught Jackson Pollock how to do drip painting. And so Siqueiros is one of the major figures in all of Western art, and he's dismissed as a kind of, he's a Mexican scene muralist. And so I want to take the Siqueiros connection and then connect it up into the story that the student, this fellow that I'm working with, is doing about graffiti artists and muralists. So I have a kind of vision of a very visual art book on Los Angeles, which is going to require a publisher who's able to do things in color, which I haven't been able to do before. So I haven't really. I started on this some time ago for a Getty project, strangely enough, and never published anything from it. Now I'm sort of recovering it and thinking about another kind of book before I disappear somewhere.
I have a question about scalability, and it seems to me that in the concept of spatial justice that you've been sharing with us, there's kind of this magical regional scale of organizing and of movements that if it's too small and not connected enough at neighborhood level, it doesn't work. It has to have a kind of certain critical mass in this magical regional vision. So, and I wonder if there's a way that then extends to some of the more global geography issues that you also brought up earlier in your thoughts tonight. Yeah. I mean, does it only work if you have regional movements that are coincident, like such as in the Occupy movement, or are there some other mechanisms or organizations for extending the concept of social justice or spatial justice to those larger and ultimately global scales?
Well, you're tapping something very dear to me. I'm in many ways more a regionalist than I am an urbanist. A regionalist, somebody who espouses the region as a very useful tool for doing everything, and lots of different things. And I'm hoping to give another lecture before I leave on what I'm calling regional urbanization, because this is another very important part of what I do. And I love when you're talking about sort of magical, but it's not really magical, but what I'm arguing is that I've been studying urban change, urban restructuring over the last 30 or 40 years, not just in LA, but all over the place. And I think what's been happening is much more than just piecemeal changes and accumulated changes, but a radical, epical species change in the very nature of the urbanization process. That we have in our minds something called a metropolitan model of the city. First of all, this metropolitan model isn't always there. It evolves in the late 19th century and dominates the 20th century and dominates all of our talks about modernity and all of modern metropolis. But what I'm saying is that modern metropolis, what was its features? It usually had one big urban core that was dense and exciting and criminal and crime and artistic and all of that, heterogeneous culturally, migrants coming in and out and so on. It's exciting. And then there was a break and there was sprawling suburbia. Two worlds, a dualism in the metropolis. An urban world and a literature that talked about cities, and a suburban world with a totally different literature about suburbanism as a way of life. That's the model that we have in our mind, and we're assuming, oh my God, that's going to forever. That all we're seeing is little changes, or maybe big changes, in a little bit about that metropolitan model. You know, edge cities, outer cities, boomburgs, post-suburb. These are 1,000 words of people sort of saying, oh my God, this is changing entirely. And I'm arguing that it is changing. And a new model is emerging, and it's called regional urbanization. It's not just, it happens to be a region, but it's a regional urbanization that's marking the end of the metropolis era, the opening of a new era in the 20th century of regional cities, city regions. That's what we're going to be talking about. We're not going to be talking about metropolitan areas, Greater Montreal. No, it's going to be the city region or the regional city. That's going to be on our vocabulary for the next 50 years. And it's got a different dynamic. It's erasing the difference between urban and suburban. It's making that difference almost non-existent anymore. We can't tell the difference. Maybe you can do it here still. In Los Angeles in particular, you can't tell the difference between what's suburban and what's urban. It was difficult before, but now it's even worse. You know, people who do comparative studies of metropolitan areas in the United States, they shouldn't be doing this anymore, because they don't know what do they do for Los Angeles. What they typically do is take the city of Los Angeles, half of which is still classically suburban, the San Fernando Valley, much of it, and they take the city of Los Angeles, that's 4 million people, the rest of the county of Los Angeles, 6 million, 7 million more, 85 municipalities, that's suburban. Los Angeles has, my latest estimate, 40 cities of 100,000 or more clustered around it. Are these suburbs? Is Long Beach 500,000 people? That's a suburb? Santa Ana, Anaheim, 300, are these suburbs? What? We don't know what they are. In much of Orange County, there are places where there are more jobs than bedrooms. What's this? And so the regional urbanization argument is really and that's why, and it really relates more closely in some ways to architectural thinking and urban design, that it's sort of saying that there's a sea change going on. It's not just a kind of accumulation of change, but a switch in the very model of what a city is like. And this new regional model has other kinds of features to it. It's flattening out. The old density decline was very sharp and then low density sprawl. If you look at the density of urbanized regions in the United States, you discover what's the densest urban region in the United States? Los Angeles. Los Angeles is denser than New York or Chicago or the Bay Area or Washington or whatever, because Los Angeles has a peak in the middle with, it lost 1.5 million domestic blacks and whites and got 5 million migrants. So the center is dense, packed, and the suburbs have become cities. So the density gradient, instead of this, is like this in LA. And this is something, again, studying LA made it even more vivid than many other places, but I think something like this is happening everywhere. Washington, D.C., Maryland and Virginia around the District of Columbia are now becoming urbanized. They're not suburban anymore. Baltimore is a kind of urban outlier of Washington. The Bay Area is a kind of structure of different cities. Polycentric, networked urbanism is what's happening. The Europeans are advanced already, the EU, and doing major studies of governance problems in polycentric city regions, city region governments and city region planning, new kinds of spatial planning going on in Europe. But the American urban establishment, North American urban establishment, hasn't recognized it. So yeah, the regions are very special for me, and I'm because of a lot of radical changes that have been taking place, promoting a regional kind of urbanization. The urban and the regional are meshing together in ways they never meshed together before. You could separate them 30, 40 years ago. Today they've like converged together. And the other thing you were asking about connection to the global, there's been a kind of unleashing of urbanization that happens with regional urbanization. So regional urbanization now explodes beyond the old hinterlands. These networks are growing larger and larger and larger and larger. The city region of Shanghai, I once asked, the government of China has put a new organization to deal with the city region of Shanghai, which is the lower Yangtze. I said, how many people here? 75 million people live in the city region of Shanghai. 60 million in the lower Pearl River Delta. 110 million in the two major centers in Honshu in Japan. What is this? And you know, of all people, Richard Florida in a Newsweek article is now doing something he's calling megalopolitan regions that are sort of continental scale regions. So Asia now, he says, there's a kind of pan-Asian monster urban region, mega region. That's the word, being mega city region, but mega regions. The whole vocabulary is changing to capture this. And in Asia, it's 600 million people. In Europe, it's 300 million. In the United States, it's around 250 million. These giant continental urban cores that, you know, regional urbanization is going everywhere. The whole world is becoming urbanized. I've been writing about this. It's not just the cities that are becoming globalized. The globe is becoming urbanized. The Amazon basin is urbanized. Siberia is urbanized. The Sahara is urbanized. The Antarctic ice cap is urbanized. It's not that it has big cities with skyscrapers. That's not what I'm talking about. But it has the features of urban control, culture, spreading over it. It has increasing settlement that is shaping what's happening locally. And even if there's small settlers, not necessarily. Well, the Amazon, I've got a student now who's doing major work on Manaus and Belém. They're becoming million cities. They just discovered that, oh, I'm sorry, you opened up a very interesting area, but they just discovered in the upper Amazon that there was traditionally, pre-Columbian, cities in the rainforest. You know, everybody says you can't have cities in the rainforest. The soils are so bad. You can't do agriculture. Well, you know, one of my colleagues actually was a physical biogeographer, and she was also arguing that she discovered that what they did in these ancient urban areas was to use charcoal and mix the fired charcoal into the soil, the dead soil, and sort of livened the soil and made it relatively possible to grow crops. In the past, it's been forgotten, and now it's sort of coming out again in some of these things. So yeah, there's a kind of the regional urbanization process that I'm studying in urban contexts is also unleashed to the globe in another process, an extended form of this, that I'm also interested in, but I mean, it's enough to just make the argument about regional urbanization.